Greetings. My name is Becca Konomopoulos. I'm the director of the Natural History Museum. And that was Willie Dunn you just heard, a Micmac and Scottish-Irish musician with his song, Son of the Sun. I want to welcome you to the Colorado River and the Colonial Blindspot. This is a 1-hour panel discussion curated by Diné geographer and Red Natural History fellow Andrew Curley and organized by the Natural History Museum. I want to thank our sponsors, that's Hewlett Foundation and For Culture, and also give a shout out to our panelists who you should see on camera there, who will give a wave, and the Natural History Museum's research director, Steve Lyons, will introduce them shortly. Just some quick housekeeping. As attendees, we won't be able to see or hear you, but we encourage you to please introduce yourself in the chat. We'd love to know where you're zooming in from, and also what brought you to this event, what you're hoping to get out of it. And I'll say that you'll have an opportunity to submit questions as well. So you'll notice a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll be monitoring that. And hopefully our plan is to field 1 or 2 questions as a part of the discussion in the event. So this is the first event in a new ongoing series by the Natural History Museum, which is a traveling pop-up and online museum founded by artists, activists, and scholars. And our inaugural cohort of Red Natural History Fellows are a group of 8 Indigenous and allied critical geographers and scholars and practitioners and humanities professionals and others who are making change within their disciplines and institutions related to natural history. So I encourage you to check out the rest of the series. I'm going to kick it over to Steve, our research director, who will tell you a little bit more about it.
Great. Thank you, Becca, and thank you everyone for joining us for the first event in our new year-long virtual series, Natural History for a World in Crisis. So this much is clear. The world we live in is a world in crisis. With the daily news headlines reminding us about the ever more frequent superstorms, species die-offs, melting glaciers, climate displacements, and land grabs, not to mention the brutal war on Gaza, it is easy to feel like our world is going to hell and we're all going with it. This year's event series is an effort to respond to the helplessness and hopelessness that can take root in times like this and make change appear impossible, beginning with a simple hypothesis. This world of extraction, exploitation, and fortified borders was built on the backs of our ancestors, but it has never been our world. Certainly, it's conditioned the habitats we live in, shaping our experience, our means of subsistence and survival. But this world is no more our world than a dammed river is the world for the wild salmon. Natural history for a world in crisis is an opportunity for us to explore fundamental questions about how centuries of capitalism and colonialism have conditioned us to see, understand, and relate to the land and each other. But it's also a context for us to train ourselves in another way of seeing, one guided not by the compulsion to dominate, control, extract, or exploit, but by a collective desire to preserve life in all its forms. And lastly, this is a platform for scientists, scholars, organizers, and community members to come together to think ambitiously about what kinds of natural history institutions and institutional practices we need if we are to break from the paradigm that got us into the mess that we are in today. So today's event asks us to question how we've become accustomed to seeing the Colorado River, challenging us to consider even the most taken for granted categories that environmental scientists have come to lean on. How has the Colorado River transformed over the past 2 centuries of colonization? And how can an understanding of this colonial history reshape not only how we understand the contemporary water crisis, but also our collective response to it? So Andrew Curley will start us off with a short 15-minute presentation, followed by responses from Teresa Montoya, Traci Brynne Voyles, and Erika Bsumek, each of whom has spent years studying the colonial history of the Colorado River and its tributaries. So we'll be dropping links in the chat over the course of the event. You're welcome to contribute to the conversation via the chat function, or if you have a question for one of our panelists, you can submit it via the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So we'll try to take a few audience questions at the end of the session, but as there's not much time, we won't likely get to all of them. So with that said, I'll send it over to Andrew. Take it away.
Thank you. Right, I think you can see my screen. And thank you, Red Natural History. Thank you, Natural History Museum, for giving me the opportunity to share some work. Thank you to the panelists who agreed to read my paper in advance and have some feedback that you'll all hear in real time, so it'll be exciting. Yat Andrew Curley Nishe, Bilagana Nishle, Hanagatni Bashachin Bilagan Dashacheki Ani Dashanale. I'm a member of the Navajo Nation and an assistant professor in the School of Geography, Development, and Environment. And the title of my presentation is this ongoing concept. I'm building off of other people's work, but I'm bridging ideas of rivers and in the specific reference, I'm looking at abolition ecology, but moving it more towards a colonial critique and maybe a decolonizing framework. I'm still working out the moving pieces of it. But the title and the idea I'm working with is this idea of colonial becoming and how we can understand or re-understand and reevaluate the Colorado River by understanding it through its colonial history. Hold on. Right. That's good. So the Colorado River gets its name from Canyon Country, where armed Spanish colonizers in search of territory and gold first described the water to a European audience as reddish in appearance. In other words, the Colorado River is a colonial idea. This is not an indigenous name for the river or any of its tributaries. The nearly 30 indigenous nations today who live in the area and stake some claim to the river have multiple and diverse ways of understanding it. Their knowledges are deep and particular to place, linked to generations of observations in specific terrain and environments, and not broad and abstract. And that's a crucial difference. Yet they are the last, I should say, are the last to claim a stake in the river within the present colonial system of water divisions in this larger water regime understood in the language of rights to water, rights to diversion, rights to use surface waters. And that's the way that the Colorado River is being described and debated in the 7 Colorado River Basin states and in the Colorado River basins in a general sense. So that's the context of the conversation. When the Colorado River, as it was understood in 1922, more than 100 years ago at this point, was divided near Santa Fe, New Mexico, there were no indigenous peoples to stake claim to the river or to account for their historic and ongoing use of the river, not only the river but also the tributaries that we're describing. Their voices were purposefully absent. They were excluded, as if they no longer mattered. The only clause in the Colorado Compact which establishes the law of the river, which establishes the governance of the river as it exists today, refers to indigenous people quickly and only to the federal government's responsibility to provide water to these tribes. That is it. Nothing concrete, nothing definitive. The nations who have used the river the longest weren't a party to its carving out. Perhaps the naming and describing of the Colorado River at this point was its first colonial act. It is a river of colonial becoming. And I use this term, the scramble of the Colorado River. It's in reference to the scramble of Africa, much like how Africa was divided among European powers at the conference in Berlin in the 19th century, which created all sorts of colonial violences on the continent. The Colorado River was divided among the 7 colonial states that recently emerged in the Colorado River Basin. That's Arizona, California, Nevada, Utah, Wyoming, Colorado, and New Mexico. And some of those representatives are featured in that black and white photograph you see there with Herbert Hoover presiding over the event. He was, I think, Secretary of Commerce at the time. And I included in this slide a picture of Chi Dodge, one of our Nat'anis, one of our Diné leaders, who was known at that time, as a leader of Diné people, but not present at the Colorado Compact. And this is somebody for our tribe who could have been there and could have been talking about the Diné understandings of the Little Colorado River, the main stem, the San Juan River, but he was not present, and neither were any of the other indigenous nations. So these are the kinds of people who were being excluded from the dividing of the river. For the Colorado River, the river's becoming was when it was first described as a river, as a unified object and as a source of regular water for some of the most arid, dry, but also diverse regions throughout the world. The river and its mystique, it became a mystique, served colonial narratives about conquering the West and making it habitable for white homesteaders. The river was amplified as something that could be a regular source of water for future settlement. It was something that needed to be there for westward expansion. So it was imagined as this ideal of something necessary for the colonialism that would later unfold. As President Roosevelt said in 1902, leading up to the passage of the Reclamation Act, the reclamation of the unsettled arid public lands presents a unique or different kind of problem. Here it is not enough to regulate the flow of streams. The object of the government is to dispose of the land to settlers who will build homes upon it. To accomplish this object, water must be brought within their reach. That has been the governing logic of the government, the federal government, and the state governments since that time. And it's been to move the Colorado River to engineer it for white settlers. Nothing better summarizes this than those statements. Initially, for Anglophone colonialists, the Colorado River was the water that flowed through the Grand Canyon and emptied into the Gulf of California. It is over the course of the 20th century, with expanding agriculture interests in states like Colorado and Utah, also in Arizona, when the Colorado River, again, as a colonial idea, is expanded northward to give these newly created states a claim to the waters of the river. So it became something that originates now in our popular mapping of the river in the Rocky Mountain National Park, when, as I write in the paper, it was originally described at the junction of Green and Grand River, somewhere north of the Arizona border. So the actual description of the river has changed over time to fit the colonial interest in it. It should be said here that damming and diverting the Colorado River and its tributaries was in service to colonial expansion and against the idea of sustainability in the region. Each dam and diversion attempted to pool water and create reservoirs for more and more expansion. The infrastructures were a stopgap for overuse, limited resources, and unsustainable growth. Issues not addressed when we talk about climate change as a problem of the Colorado River. So what I'm arguing in this paper is that our whole way of thinking about the problem of sustainability and of water accessibility is rooted in unsustainable use. So we tend to focus on this issue of climate change when really there's never been enough water for settler designs. And each time there's a new infrastructure built onto the river's tributaries, it's satisfying a temporary problem that is quickly overwhelmed by more and more settlers. It's the nature of settler colonialism in the region to create unsustainable growth, and to a point where we have ecological crisis all up and down this aggregate of water we're referring to as a river. So this postcard actually I found in a thrift store many years ago depicts the falls in the Arizona Canal, which is an earlier canal that existed before the compact. One of the initial diversions really served Mormon interest near Mesa, Arizona, outside of Phoenix. And then you can see these are images coming out of a book that out of our archives here at the U of A. It was a book published in 1922 when the river was being divided and dammed, showing you the object of government, right, that Roosevelt was referring to. So we have on the bottom panel, the bottom image, a reclaimable desert in Arizona. So this language of reclamation to move water into places for home sites, for settlers, for agricultural interests, and to transform the ecology of the region has been in the designs of settler publications and objects of governance for more than 100 years, and is the origin of the environmental crisis that we're talking about today. Here are some more examples of damming along the tributaries of what is the Colorado River, the Gila River and the Salt River. We have two different dams, Roosevelt Dam and the Coolidge Dam, creating new reservoirs, solving problems of overexpansion, solving problems of diverting water away from tribes and towards white settlements. And then in the example of the Coolidge Dam, that dam had to be created, flooding San Carlos Apache land in order to bring water to the Gila River Indian community who had rights to water from the Gila River, but that water was being diverted before reaching their community by land speculators upstream. So these infrastructures have to do with land dispossession and wealth accumulation all along these river basins against the interests of tribes. And the issue of environmental sustainability and overuse of water has always been there. And this is one of the other claims I'm trying to make here. And reviewing some of the literature on the Colorado River and looking at some of the ways it's been described over time, you can see that there's this climate anxiety that predates our language and our debates about climate change. So going into the Arizona Highway Magazine in 1947 issue that focused a lot specifically on these dams and diversions happening or being projected at the time, the then editor of the magazine, a guy named Raymond Carson, says, and I put in bold important points, always over the land is a threat of drought. Right, so they're talking about drought in the 40s. Several times in recent years, the snows were light in the winter, the rains did not come, and the water stored behind the dams was low. Same type of anxieties that we're talking about with climate change, but they're talking about it as if it's a natural feature of the river, it's the instability of the water and how, and then getting toward the end of the quote, nature's whims can be circumvented. So the idea is that we need to build infrastructure to overcome these problems. If man is wise and looks towards the future, both nature and the future are a challenge. So the idea is that there's always been an anxiety about drought, about uneven snowpack, rain, failing to come over a season. So the idea of the idea of this landscape as being something that is controllable has been a part of the colonial apparatus since the Reclamation Act, and has been part of the larger discourse in Arizona since at least the 40s, but going back to the 20s, actually, if we examine it. And here are some more examples of some of that hubris and some of the damming that happened and the engineering of a river after the fact. So we got the Boulder Canyon Dam, or what becomes a Hoover Dam, pictured on the left, and the Central Arizona Project on the right. And these further concretize and make into legal fact the diversion and the division of the water that originated in the Colorado Compact. So what does this have to do with these issues that we were presented with at the beginning, these ideas of crisis, these crisis narratives that we're dealing with? Well, I want to turn our attention now to the way modern science is dealing with these questions. And they're talking about drought, they're talking about snowpack, they're talking about precipitation, but they're not talking about colonialism. And I think that limits the kinds of environmental solutions that are possible and the way we even conceptualize political alternatives to these diversions and divisions and infrastructure of the river. Okay, there we go. So here's an example of that kind of thinking. Read most reports about the Colorado River, and you will inevitably find a reliance on colonial names, divisions, colonial assumptions as ways of summarizing natural features of the river. For example, in a well-known paper discussing the potential impacts of climate change on future water flows through the river, Bradley Udall and Jonathan Overpeck inevitably rely on colonial names and infrastructures to understand certain effects on the river. They make the argument that a prolonged drought from 2020 to 2014 anticipates a period of less water in the river sometime in the next century, and because of climate change. Udall and Overpeck divide the basin into its known political division at Lee's Ferry, so-called upper and lower basins, while discussing reservoir levels behind large dams on the river, such as the Hoover Dam and the Glen Canyon Dam. This has the effect of making these dams appear as if they're a natural feature of water. The naturalization of the river, the naturalization of the colonization of the river, sorry, that's awkward right on my end, limits how we can even think about environmental problems and solutions. Continuing with our example from above, Udall and Overpeck conclude their paper with quote, climate change threats to Western water supply are very real and should prompt great concern and urgency among water managers and the citizens of the Southwest, close quote. On the surface, this statement reads very reasonable and captures the stakes of our political and environmental challenge in the so-called management or governance of the river. However, this statement does two things to evade the colonial problem and perpetuate dangerous environmental intrusions. First, it directs our attention toward climate change and away from the hyper-exploitation of the river, or even damming as the main threat to the multiple people and life forms that rely on the river and its tributaries. Second, it implies a settler colonial we in the form of citizen of the Southwest, i.e. the benefactors of colonial divisions, infrastructures, policies, and laws that comprise the governance of the river are those who are seen to benefit from this discourse on climate change. This kind of science stipulates the colonial acts and completely ignores indigenous problems. The we doesn't include the tribes lacking basic water rights and infrastructure, features of a social world these scientists benefit from, but are less willing to identify. What is worse, the science avoids the problem of too much consumption and too much colonialism. Settler colonialists ushered in profound ecological changes to the region that are unsustainable, from ranching to damming of surface waterways. They have turned to science in land-grant universities, like where I am right now, that's providing my Wi-Fi service at the moment, to fix the problems their behavior created. To this degree, damming and overgrazing and diversions and aridification aren't new problems. They are the long-standing threats to the indigenous peoples, plants, and animals in a region that are already profoundly damaging. Climate science, inattentive to colonial realities, are replicating colonial dispossession and are colonial acts. This work contributes to a river becoming the climate science, a river understood only through the lens of colonial conquests and anxieties, which include climate change impact on existing overuse of the waters that comprise the idea of the river. In a colonial universe, it is a colonial becoming. And this slide here is an example of that, where the natural flow includes reservoirs and regulations. So that's how it's naturalized. It's even naturalized in the formulas that the scientists are putting forward to anticipate water loss. I'll close with a couple of quotes that I think are really interesting. So again, coming out of that 1947 special issue of Arizona Highway Magazine, one of their popular writers at the time, Gussie Thomas Smith, writes, "With incredible audacity, the deed is done. The Colorado River has literally been sold down the river. What the victim may be planning to do someday to the Boulder Dam project is of no concern for several generations." That was in 1947. Just a few years ago, Mojave Gila River poet Natalie Diaz writes, "Do you think the water will forget what we have done, what we continue to do?" And with those words, we can contemplate the river and open it up for the other panelists.
Thank you, Andrew, for this presentation. Absolutely mind-blowing indictment of some of the obfuscations that are present in contemporary environmental science. So I'd love to move it on to the next portion of the event, where we have responses from Teresa Montoya, Traci, Brynne Voyles, and Erika Bsumek. I won't introduce you as you go, so you'll just pass it on to the next one. So Teresa, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. So I'll just give my own Diné introduction. She'e Teresa Montoya nishe tatnezani nishle. Biligane bashishchin. Ashika dashiche ado nakai dashanele. Also, Andrew and I are from the same part of the Navajo Reservation on the Arizona side. So we're also probably blood related, in addition to our clan relations that we have stated. So I kind of wanted to give a response to this paper from a more Diné epistemology. So even though those of you who are gathered here on Zoom together haven't had the fortune of reading Andrew's paper, I'm just going to draw out some of the main critiques that he has kind of summarized in this presentation for you, but also to posit some of the important contributions I think this could make to understanding what is this so-called Colorado River crisis. So in Andrew's paper, he interrogates the colonial underpinnings of what we have understood to be the Colorado River in crisis. This critique, as I view it, is twofold. One, Andrew skillfully argues how, quote, the river was brought into a singular systemic understanding, which we understand through the fields of hydrology, geography, and geology, which, as Andrew argues, are all colonial in their formation. So the rendering of this singular object of the Colorado River is projected also through the imaginary of the Colorado Basin. And this is at odds with the grounded and relational Indigenous and specifically Diné understandings of water. In other words, the object of the Colorado River is shot through acre-feet calculations and a matrix of diversion and dam infrastructures, has abstracted the ways that we and our Diné ancestors have related to the river. How have Diné related and continue to relate to the river and to our environments more broadly? You point to Diné understandings of both space and time as absent from contemporary renderings of water governance. Spatially, our Diné people situate ourselves within our four sacred mountains. Two of these mountains are actually located in the current state of Colorado, which I think is ironic given that our current geopolitical boundaries of the Navajo Nation do not include actually any land holdings in Colorado. And one of our other sacred mountains to the east is located in New Mexico. And then our last mountain to the west is located near Flagstaff, Arizona. And I invite all of you actually just to Google right now, Diné for sacred mountains, so you can kind of get a better sense of this relational ontology. And also it's, I think, important to note that our ancestral homelands overlap with other homelands of our neighboring Indigenous relatives, you know, Hopi, Zuni, and other Puebloan tribes. And a lot of their sacred mountains overlap with ours. So this is not to presume that only Diné have or hold these spaces to be sacred, but rather that our relational understandings are encompassing and overlapping with many of our other Indigenous relatives in the Southwest. And beyond our mountains, we also have male and female rivers that flow within our sacred mountains that have provided sustenance for human and animal kin alike. This spatialization is encompassing not only of a basin ecology, but of a broader universe of relational obligations. And I want to repeat that notion of relational obligation. So to relate to a landscape in this way also demands a sort of relation of accountability or obligation to care for and steward the land. It's not meant to merely be taking or extracting from the land, but you also have to be giving back to it. It's a reciprocal relationship. On the other hand, what we might term modern water, or like the so-called natural resources in a settler colonial paradigm, was imagined only important for its productive potential, how it might be put to, quote, beneficial use. This is a logical extension of settler ideas of property law that imagined land to be owned by whoever performed labor upon it, building on ideas of John Locke. So in this way, this logic also rationalizes large-scale infrastructure and agriculture, which are also require lots of use of water. Furthermore, Andrew builds upon the work of Jen Rose Smith to argue how settlers imposed a temperate normativity onto diverse landscapes, taking places like the Arctic and deserts alike as bereft of water and in need of geoengineering. So not only were our homelands imagined to be uninhabitable for settlers, despite our ancestors living and surviving in these desert environments since time immemorial, but they were also imagined to be in need of settler intervention to make it productive for large-scale settlement and later resource extraction. You argue how the notion of acre-feet quantifications actually emerged from California mining production in the late 19th century. And for those who are unfamiliar, an acre-foot is understood to be equal to 1 acre of land flooded with 1 foot of water, or about 325,851 gallons. And if that doesn't bog your mind, I mean, it just kind of gives an example of the seemingly random abstractions of settler colonial water governance. So you show how this quantification was transformed from a mining logic to an agricultural one in early American frontier history. The acre foot a year was the new temporal understanding of water. And furthermore, you argue how the acre foot is measured by calendar year and not by any time frame a river might recognize. And I really like that quote in particular, because what would it mean to imagine these questions from the perspective of the river? What would it mean to think about water governance from the perspective of Indigenous nations, both ancestrally and today? And so in doing so, I want to end by pointing to the temporal implications that your critique raises. For instance, you posit how Diné temporal frameworks rely upon understandings of farmist and harvest cycle. And I can't think of a better way to think of that is, our calendar year. You mentioned how Diné New Year actually begins in October, which is the beginning of the year with Gaje, so October, which is the beginning of our, or the second month of our harvest. So to imagine, the year itself oriented around harvest relationships. And also one of our months is also in relation to water. So January, Jasnicht is in reference to melting snow. So this would be the time in the middle of the winter when, presumably the ground is frozen, maybe not so much anymore with climate change, but this would be the time that our ancestors would go and they would need to heat the snow over an open fire in order to melt it for water. So all of these relationships with water and with the environment are embedded not only within the actual, the space of where our ancestors and our people continue to live within the four sacred mountains, but it's also built into how we keep time. And if you have that relationship and understanding built into your spatialization and our temporal frameworks, how then does that demand a different way to relate to our environment? So I just want to leave it with those open questions, and I will pass it on to our next speaker. Thank you.
Wow, thank you, Teresa. My mind was going a million miles an hour while you were talking through those comments, and I was sort of frantically taking notes. So hello, everybody. I'm absolutely thrilled to be here in this company. Andrew, I first want to say thank you for this paper. I'm really lucky to get to be in conversation with both you and Teresa, and also with Erika quite frequently. And I just want to say that I never fail to learn things that transform my worldview whenever we're in conversation. So Andrew, it's an honor to have been able to read this paper and to see you present on it. And I can't say enough about how generative this work is. And I think Teresa's comments really speak to the number of kind of jumping off places that we have to think about something as big and important as the Colorado River watershed. So like Teresa, I was really inspired by a lot of the generative frameworks that you set out in the paper. I had to pick one to talk about in this short amount of time. So I wanted to take one up in particular, and it was the one that I couldn't get out of my mind after I'd read the paper. And that is the idea about thinking about the history of a river's becoming, right? And the way that whoever is sort of spotlighted as the storyteller of a river's becoming sort of gets to interpret that river based on their own environmental worldview and cultural location. So I've spent a lot of time thinking about the power and politics behind those stories and the storytelling about how a river becomes a river, how a river comes to be understood in one particular way. And I wanted to just make a small, make a very small kind of entry point into your project in these 5 minutes by thinking about the California story of the rivers becoming. And I love the way that California history intersects with the larger work that you're doing around current day Arizona. So I wanted to tell three very, very brief stories. I will keep them short, I promise. And they're all set in the lower part of the Colorado River near its delta with the Gulf of California. So the first story that I wanted to tell is set on Quechan land, right at the confluence of the Gila River and the Colorado River in 1909. So I've been looking at this confluence because it was it's the site of one of the first federal dams that was constructed along the Colorado River. So it's called the Laguna Dam. It was completed in 1909. And when it was opened, it was this massive kind of dam site meant to control the Colorado River and provide water to Southern California. And when it was first completed, they threw this huge party at the dam. And the vast majority of the people who were there to celebrate were people who had come in on a train from LA. They were all sponsored by the LA Chamber of Commerce. And they were in what was currently Arizona territory. Arizona wasn't even a state yet. And the reason that they said that they had come there from LA was that this was one of the most important part of what they called LA's backcountry. So not even California's backcountry, but LA's backcountry. They saw it as the hinterlands of LA's urban development. This way in which the very first California story about damming and controlling the Colorado River is about the way that it can be used and exploited, and the water can be extracted to be taken to somewhere pretty far afield from the Colorado River Basin into LA. And what happened at this big party that was being attended by almost 1,000 members of the LA Chamber of Commerce is that they asked, as part of a parade that they organized, that a number of people who they described as Cocopas, but were more likely Quechan people, had dressed up in regalia and paraded down along the side of this new dam. And they were followed by people who were dressed up as either settlers or railroad technicians. And it was a pageant essentially of progress. And it was this idea of teleological progress that the dam was meant to signify. So it was this kind of cultural marker, but it was also a very, very real temporal marker because the dam desiccated a huge part of the Quechan's floodplain farmland. And once the dam was constructed, because that farmland had been ruined, that's the point at which Quechans were removed onto reservations. And so damming the Colorado River became this very important origin story for how that process unfolded in California, and always linked in the story of the rivers becoming to these early narratives about California exceptionalism and the way that settlers built that on the exploitation of the river and dispossession of Native peoples. And there's a lot in that story also about the exploitation of the labor of laborers of color and those kinds of things. So I wanted to tell that story. And then I wanted to tell a story of what happened after the Colorado River flooded part of the California desert to create what we currently call the Salton Sea, which damaged or destroyed a huge number of very recently established Imperial Valley farms. Settlers had first arrived there in 1901. It was very clear that it was a place that was regularly flooded by the Colorado River. They established farms there anyway, and very predictably, certainly it was predicted by the Native people, the local Kumeyays and Kauias, who told them that their farms would be flooded. Very quickly, it was flooded. And just a few years after that, is part of a process of what I like to sometimes call the settler art of failing up. They turned that disaster into massive kind of infrastructural policy, and the Imperial Valley Irrigation District became some of the strongest advocates for the construction of what was at that time being called the Colorado Dam, or the Boulder Dam, which is now the Hoover Dam. And so that initiation of this massive infrastructure project on the Colorado River, I know you know this, really came out of the desire for settlers to control the lower part of the Colorado River so that they could continue something that they had only been doing for 3 years. So sort of building in that artificial idea of history, that only settlers get to make history, and whatever kinds of history that settlers make automatically has the right to be maintained over time, mostly being fueled by Native dispossession. So I point to these two stories. I had a third one, but I'm not going to tell it so that I make sure that Erika has some time to talk. But I want to talk about how these stories show how the settler history of the river's becoming really begins with extraction, profit, and control. and how these settler environmental worldviews assume that the world stays the way that it was when they found it, at least in terms of the resources that it can yield for capitalist profit making. So that acre feet that were incorrectly measured in the 1910s to estimate how much water states could have, that those kind of imaginary acre feet would continue to shape our models for water supply usage into the 21st century. So, if I started with your notion of the river becoming, I want to end with that idea of the settler colonial we, and think about, the many brilliant ways in which your work is sort of destabilizing the we-ness there, but also how that we-ness has really structured the history of the Colorado River for a little over a century, but really for only about a century in that river's very, very, very long history. So thank you, Andrew. I'll turn things over to Erika.
Okay, like Teresa and Traci, I really would like to thank Andrew for inviting me to be part of this presentation, to read the paper, to be in conversation with everybody. It's been incredibly generative. And I also want to thank Steve and Becca at Kel and Andrea for all the hard work that went into putting today's event together. So Andrew presents us with a number of really compelling ideas in his presentation and in the longer paper that some of the panelists had the chance to read. And I just want to highlight a few of those ideas and pull out and ask a couple of questions in my comments. Andrew is not just pointing out that the cycle that this kind of colonial thinking has created is unsustainable, and that it's linked to Indigenous dispossession. He's also really making an interesting case in the paper, which you hear a little bit in the presentation, but I want to kind of pull out something that we read more about in the paper. He's really making an argument that it's necessary to reorient our thinking about the river, not just in presentations like this, but in this scholarship that shapes our understanding of the river and its future. So he's really focusing on, he wants to focus on scholarship beyond that written by a kind of usual crowd of people who get cited over and over and over again when thinking about the Colorado River. So he wants to move us beyond the dominant scholarship on the river that has been largely, in his words, written by, quote, the white men who only make a passive reference, if at all, to the experience of Indigenous people on the river, end quote. So as an Indigenous geographer, he really is reorienting our view and opening up new possibilities for thinking about the river and how we think about climate change. And he's doing so in a way that doesn't replicate colonial violence, right? Opening up new scholarship, room for new voices, new thinking, rethinkings. And as part of that, I want to mention or want to pull out one observation that really demonstrates Andrew's point a little bit about this sort of these ways in which colonialism has sort of been replicated again and again in the scholarship by pointing out an irony and riffing a little bit on his idea that there are literally volumes of books and reports that have written about the Colorado River and its politics from the early 20th century to the present, and almost none of them, in his words, quote, take Indigenous water knowledges seriously or understand rivers as sites of colonial control. This comment is both true and in some ways ironic, if maybe ironic isn't exactly the right word, but it, to sort of get to this point, what is ironic about it is to get to this point where we are today for Andrew to make this intervention. Previous generations of explorers and scientists and government officials literally took and extracted Indigenous knowledge about the water, about names of water, about where water flowed, etc. They extracted that knowledge to implement their colonial visions of the water and various water schemes. So, we can link it to kind of Teresa and Andrew's discussions of how we know what we know, how we can reframe what we know, and how that reframing can open up new possibilities for understanding the river. And we could go through everybody who did that, who worked with Indigenous people over and over again, extracted their indigenous knowledge in order to implement these colonial schemes. But his research points us in a new direction. And his research, as a result of pointing us in that new direction, rests at the intersection in thinking about colonial scapes. He calls them colonial scapes in the paper. I'm not sure he used it in the presentation, but these engineered projects as colonial scapes, and water as the object of law, water as the thing that can be regulated by law, which he talked about at the beginning of the presentation. And he wants to reorient our thinking, not just about water in terms of new ways of knowing water or going back to indigenous ways of understanding water and water epistemologies, but also, and this is my question, what happens if we pair those ways of thinking with the idea of riverhood, the idea of rights of nature, that, rivers and rights of nature, riverhood and rights of nature could be interesting. So instead of rivers as object of law governed by colonial law, what happens if we think about rivers as entities with rights, rivers as subjects of law? Does that help or hinder what you are hoping to do? So thank you so much for inviting me to be part of this conversation, to engage Teresa, Andrew, and Traci with you in this conversation. And I look forward to hearing from all of you again and from the audience members.
So thank you all for your comments. And I don't want to take up any bandwidth myself on this because I think Andrew has a lot to say in response to your comments. And so maybe we'll shoot it to Andrew to respond to the very considered reflections that the three of you have put forth. And following that, if we have time, we'll take some questions from the audience. So you can, audience, you can throw those into the Q&A if you've got burning questions, which I'm sure some of you do. All right, Andrew.
All right. Thank you, Teresa, Traci, Erika. I really appreciate you taking the time to read the paper. And, when we were talking about putting this panel together, it was about, I feel a little bit shy now because I'm like, oh, it's all about this paper that I wrote and it's like kind of centered on this, but I want it to be like more open and talking about all of our unique contributions to this topic. And so, be that as it may, some of the ideas that we're talking about are included in this presentation paper. So but I'll try to respond and say that, I really appreciate first Teresa's considered feedback and really helping me in this case flesh out the temporal, meaning time, the time issues, the way that our understanding of seasons is learned through observation and learned through experience in our particular part of the what is now called the Colorado River Basin. And what I want to say is that is a very Diné way of thinking about things, a Navajo way of thinking about things, and her and I are related. But we have nearly 30 federally recognized tribes that have some sort of claim, and that's already kind of a colonial definition. And there's probably more expansive ways of thinking about indigenous history and claims, or in interactions with the rivers, tributaries, and the aquifers beneath the different basins, and to think about those different knowledges as being unique and situated and having its own kind of environmental understanding. So what the Hopi think, what the Gila River think, and what they know is going to be different than what the Diné know. So we're trying to not homogenize our indigenous understanding. I'm just coming from the perspective as a Diné person and thinking about it from our tribe's own particular history with the waters that eventually become part of the Colorado River. And then moving on to Traci, I really appreciate the stories. And actually, when you were talking about the building of the Boulder Canyon Dam, that's something that I read your book. It really helped me to think about this paper. So I'm building off of some of the history that you've done, the deep history of understanding the Salton Sea, and thinking about the colonial hubris in that particular story, in that layers of of historical episodes that then, you know, contribute to this larger aggregate of water control that I'm trying to critique here. And so like exactly what you were saying, like this Boulder Dam being built upstream only 3 years after, you know, this disaster happens. This idea of settler art of failing up is really interesting, and it's so true, yet it's like, it's funny, but also like very sad at the same time. So, so thank you for offering that and showing us, you know, like downstream and like even at the border of so-called Arizona and California, we have these related histories of indigenous water and land dispossession that are linked. You know, these are connected stories. And Erika, I obviously read and building off of your work on the history of the Glen Canyon Dam. And it was really interesting for me because I've been struggling with this writing in this paper for a couple of years now, and this is like maybe the 4th iteration of it. But as I was like really trying to figure out where does the Colorado River begin and end, and how has it been defined in colonial narratives? And I was like reading John Wesley Powell and like trying to, it's very hard reading. It's not like difficult language. It's just really boring. And then I read your book after I wrote this section. I was like, oh, you do all that work already. So if you want to understand the history of like those explorations and some of these ideologies at work, and even like the LDS narratives at play, and you know, ideas of dominion and environmental domination narratives, that's a good place to start and think through. So I'm really grateful that you're here to think through some of the things that I'm trying to say in this paper. So I appreciate that, and thank you both for your books and your work, and thank you, Teresa, for our everyday conversations on these things. And I'll stop my responses there.
I'm gonna jump in for a second. I'm sure that everyone's gonna I want everyone to have a final word, but I also want to read a few questions from the audience. Now, a bunch poured in right after I had a chance to look at some of them, so you'll just have to field those later. But two of the questions, several of the questions suggested to me that people have a hunger for thinking about like what this means for the future. You know, in a sense, inviting you to speculate about you know, what solutions might be on offer. So Matthew Brockmeyer asks, how do any of the panelists see a colonial understanding of the river gaining traction in discussions about what happens from this point? So I think, Andrew, you started to address that in your presentation, but maybe addressing directly how these colonial understandings of the river are kind of actually like gaining momentum in contemporary discussions. Is there a ramping up happening at the policy level, potentially? And then Alan Compagnon writes, do you see any immediate politically feasible solutions to reverse the colonialist exploitation of the river that would return the waters to indigenous communities? So in other words, if seeing the history of this sort of massive engineering project as a massive colonial engineering project shows us that certain solutions are being foreclosed, what are those solutions that are being foreclosed, and how can they be made viable?
So I'll give my quick response, and I can open it up to the other panelists too if they have some thoughts. But yeah, the solution question, it's I think it's very so the thing I'm trying to point out, right, is that these ideas get reproduced. So it's not just that they're in history, but because they're not interrogated in history, they end up being reproduced in new scholarship and in new ways of thinking, and eventually in new policy frameworks. And I would describe it in a broader sense as an enclosure. It's an enclosure on indigenous access to waters and rivers. And we're kind of in the final throes of that with water litigation, water rights, and settlements, either the litigation or water rights settlements. And so in the past, I've written a couple of papers on water rights settlements and the critique of that. And the larger critique is that it's making us conform to this law of the river, this governance of the Colorado River that is fundamentally unsustainable, that is in the interest of growth and expansion of urban areas, even more so against agricultural lands, even those were the original exploitative areas. But anyway, so the short of it is, think the productive solution, and one that is that I think is feasible, that every water lawyer will tell you is an impossibility, is to redo or undo the Colorado Compact and come up with a totally different way of governing the water. One that is inclusive of tribes at the starting point, not at the end point, and one that is that features in that agreement notions of sustainability that are necessary for the survival of ecosystems from the delta all the way up to the origin points. So, those kinds of things need to be prioritized in the future human interactions with the waters that we're calling the Colorado River. And we can do that. A good starting place is to undo the Colorado Compact. Right now, we're reifying it. We're reproducing it in settlements, in policy structures, in federal mandatory reductions. So everything we're doing is just reinforcing the Colorado River Compact. It's the legal political framework that allows all of this to happen. All I'm saying, very simple solution, let's undo it.
Can I jump in after Andrew? Thank you. I feel like that was a political campaign slogan, like undo the compact, undo the compact. Okay. No, I mean, I was just going to say the same thing. So for all of you who are paying attention to kind of bring our attention back to this narrative of crisis, which is being used to talk about the Colorado River, you turn on the news today. I'm currently in LA, so I think I'm more privy to like things that are happening from the lower basin perspective. I was born and raised in Grand Junction, Colorado, from the upper basin. So I think it's really interesting that what you point out, Andrew, is just the conceptualization of the Colorado River as a whole and how it binds, all of these people together, but from very different landscapes and political persuasions, and of course from different tribal nations. There's over 30 basin tribes who are part of the Colorado River Basin. And so, like, what does it mean to undo the compact? Tribes, as Andrew posited, were not at the table in the 1922 compact. So that means when the Navajo Nation right now is trying to negotiate this settlement in the state of Arizona for the Little Colorado River and other tributaries, we are basically coming to the table to divvy up the crumbs of the water quantification. And to kind of use the crude metaphor that I hear time and time again about the so-called water pie, this is all based on an imaginary of hydrology from a century ago. So on the one hand, they're upholding the science that they already know is not good. And this is what the law, these compacts are based on. So to go back to the table, let's get rid of that, bring better science. So I think that they've kind of built themselves into this like feedback loop where on the one hand, we know the science actually hasn't benefited us. It's left out Indigenous peoples, but they're still clinging to the idea that somehow we can resurrect this to be more equitable when the very beginning, it wasn't equitable. So how can you actually create equality from something that is inherently inequitable?
I'm going to jump in here and say we are at time, but I want to thank all of our panelists. Thank you, Andrew, for all the work that you did in helping to organize this event and for your scholarship and knowledge sharing. And also Erika, Teresa, and Traci, you as well. We are going to be saving and sharing with you the chat transcript as well as a video recording of this event. We want to thank our sponsors and also ask you, please, to give us feedback. You'll be getting a survey in the email. And please do also stay tuned for our next event in the Natural History for a World in Crisis series, which is coming up in May with our Red Natural History Fellow and Environmental Humanities scholar and author, Ashley Dawson. Thanks, everyone. We had more than 300 people today participating, and I'll give a shout out to Marge, who at 91 years young joined us from New Jersey. So we had a really great crew, and we look forward to continuing the conversation with you. We also saved the Q&A, so I'll circle back with our speakers and see if they might have any responses to share. Thanks so much, and we'll see you next time. We're going to close it out now with Willie Soon's Song of the Sun. He's a Micmac and Scottish-Irish musician. Bye, everyone.
Son of the sun, son of the earth, the soul of life, children of